Welcome to Budget MTG Decks. All magic fun, all cards under $1. I'm David, this is my buddy Ruud.
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about a fun and effective EDH deck, also known as a commander deck. As with all our decks, it's going to be built without spending a lot of money. And there's just one additional build rule with our decks, that is that all cards need to be under $1 in price, with the exception of our commander. Now with today's commander we're going to be playing our opponent's decks. So let's see what the commander is going to look like.
Yeah, and we have an awesome commander today. We have Lazav, Dimir Mastermind for 2 blue and 2 black. We get a 3/3 hexproof creature. Now the beauty of Lazav is that whenever a creature card is put into one of our opponent's graveyards, that means whether a creature dies or gets milled into our opponent's graveyard, Lazav may choose to become that creature, except it still retains hexproof and can still become another creature later on in the game if a creature ends up in an opponent's graveyard. So the role of this commander is going to be to wait till creatures go into the graveyards, into our opponent's graveyards, then become some nice fatty and deal commander damage and win the game that way. So what kind of cards are we going to need to make this happen?
Well, besides the commander, of course, we will have 27 control cards. We're going to do a lot of controlling in this deck, especially the biggest stuff on the battlefield, and we would like to, of course, become that with our other cards and with Lazav. We have 9 milling cards. We're going to mill our opponent's decks to make sure we have enough stuff in the graveyard for Lazav to become, or other cards. We have 15 graveyard interaction cards. We have 8 utility cards we couldn't categorize otherwise, and of course we need 40 land cards.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the turn progression going to look like?
Well, of course, ideally it will be turn 1 milling, turn 2 maybe some additional milling, turn 3 we would like to cast an assassin, turn 4 our commander, turn 5 a counterspell, and then turn 6 we would like to use the opponent's graveyards to our benefit. And of course maybe some control.
Yeah, so the main way that Lazav becomes a creature from our opponent is by controlling the battlefield and destroying our creature's opponents so they end up in a graveyard. So let's have a look at the control cards. We've divided the control spells into counter spells, assassin spells, and other removal spells. We're going to start with Remove Soul for 2 mana. It's counter target creature spell, which is the same as Essence Scatter and False Summoning.
And we also have Psychic Barrier. It's also a counter target creature spell, but now the controller of the spell loses 1 life. We have Exclude next, and that is 3 mana, but this time we also draw a card. Then we have Soul Manipulation. That's also the same, but this time you can choose to also return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. We chose to include a lot of counter target creature spells in the deck because we think in our format that's the most important thing to do, because most likely you will be countering commanders, and of course Lazav can become creatures that enter the battlefield, which of course won't be commander normally because they enter the command zone.
Yeah. Sometimes, however, the counter target creature spell won't be enough, and then we want some normal counter spells. So for that we have Counter Spell for 2 blue mana. And this just counters a target spell, so anything, instant, sorcery, enchantment, artifact, whatever you want. Then we have, in that same vein, we have Dissolve, which is a little bit more expensive for 3 mana, but then you can also scry 1. Then we have Dream Fracture, which is the same price, but in this case, both the controller of the spell that's countered gets to draw a card, and you get to draw a card. It's not too shabby. Lastly, we have Psychic Strike for also 3, but in this case you're also going to need a black mana. And you get to counter spell, and its controller puts the top 2 cards of his or her library into the graveyard.
Some milling. Could be nice.
Could be nice. Okay, so then we move on to the assassin cards. We start with Royal Assassin for a colorless and 2 black. This creature has the ability to tap and then destroy target tapped creature.
Yeah, this is very annoying. Of course you want to put it on the battlefield as early on as possible. If it's turn 3, it's going to be able to destroy a tapped creature on turn 4. Very nice.
And then Lazav could become that creature, potentially. Evil Twin for 2 colorless and a blue and a black. We get a Shapeshifter that becomes a copy of a creature. Doesn't have to be target creature, so it could be a creature with Shroud or Hexproof. Yeah. Becomes a copy of a creature with the ability, pay a blue, pay a black, tap this creature, and then destroy target creature with the same name as this creature.
But this of course does target, so if it became a hexproof or a shroud creature, it can destroy that creature.
No.
But still.
And the beauty of it, you could have it come in as a token creature, and then if there's a lot of tokens with the same name, then you could destroy a token every single turn.
Exactly.
Yeah. Demon of Wailing Agonies for 5 mana is a 4/4 flyer with Lieutenant.
Yeah, Lieutenant means that if your commander is on the battlefield, so when Lazav is there, it's gonna be come 6/6, +2/2, and when your commander is on the battlefield, when it deals combat damage, the Demon of Wailing Agonies of course, the defending player sacrifices creature, and that is of course only when it deals combat damage to the opponent. So it's not an assassin that we choose a creature, but the opponent has to sacrifice creature, and of course it's a big fatty.
And it's killing something. Yeah, exactly. Either because it's hard to block a 6/6 flyer without your creature dying.
Exactly.
Then we have Drana Kalastria Blood Chief for 5 mana. We get a 4/4 flyer. It has a really cool ability. This what is it? Vampire Shaman.
Yeah. For X and 2 black, target creature gets -0, -X. So, well, that's the X cost until end of turn. And this card, Drana Kalastria Blood Chief, gets +X +0. So it's gonna become bigger that turn, and it's, well, usually gonna kill a creature, and that is also creatures that are indestructible and creatures that could regenerate, because they can't regenerate when their toughness becomes less. So this is very annoying, but it is mana intense.
Yeah, if you got the mana, then Drana is doing good work.
Exactly.
Reaper from the Abyss for 6 mana gives you a 6/6 flyer. These are some pretty big flyers in this deck, huh? With Morbid, which means that at the beginning of each end step, so everybody's end step, if a creature died that turn, you get to destroy target non-demon creature.
Yeah, and we are going to kill a lot of creatures with this deck, so when this comes on the table, it's going to deal even more creatures into the battlefield.
Yeah, good little assassin.
Yeah.
Overseer of the Damned is also a great assassin for 7 mana. You get a 5/5 flyer, and when Overseer of the Damned enters the battlefield, you get to destroy target creature. Bam, creature's gone. And whenever a non-token creature your opponent's control dies, you get to put down a 2/2 black zombie token.
Yeah. So when he gets cast onto the battlefield, it already destroys a creature and gives you a 2/2 zombie, if it's a non-token creature of course. And on top of that, when creatures your opponents control do damage to each other and kill each other, it also works.
Yeah, pretty sweet. Then we can move on to the removal spells. First one, Tragic Slip for a black mana. Target creature gets -1/-1 till the end of turn, but it also has Morbid, which means if a creature died this turn, it actually gets -13/-13.
Yeah, which is of course what you would like to do most likely in most cases. Then we have Bile Blight. This card is for 2 mana and it gives a creature -3/-3 and all creatures with the same name. So usually in Commander this will be against token creatures.
Yeah. If you want a little bit more punch, you can go for Grasp of Darkness for 2 black mana, and then target creature gets -4/-4.
Then we have Sudden Death for 3 mana, of which 2 black. Target creature gets also -4/-4 until end of turn, but this time it has split second. So your opponents can't play spells or activated abilities as long as this card is on the stack. So it's very hard to do something about this. You even can't regenerate. Might be interesting to know, triggered abilities still work for a split second.
Exactly. If that's all too complicated, we can just go for a very simple murder for 3 mana, destroy target creature. It doesn't get any simpler than that.
Exactly. Then we have Sudden Spoiling. It also has split second, just like the Sudden Death. Creatures target player control become 0/2 and lose all abilities until end of turn, which is of course an instant. This is very annoying when someone attacks. Well, most likely all the creatures are gonna die. It might be interesting to know that counters still count for the creature, so it becomes 0/2 and then the counters get added, and of course enchantments or artifacts that give it plus also still count.
Exactly. Then we go to Grisly Spectacle for 4 mana, destroy target non-artifact creature, as controller puts the number of cards from their library into the graveyard equal to that creature's power. Milling?
Very nice. Then we have River's Grasp, which is very strong. It returns a creature to its owner's hand. Well, of course, if you paid blue, and then if you also paid black, you can choose a card from that opponent's hand. So that opponent reveals his hand, which is also very nice to know. And then you may choose a card that he has to discard. So the creature that you removed from the battlefield can be discarded, but you could also choose something else.
Yeah.
Which goes to the graveyard.
Yeah, very simply, in its most simple form, you pay 4 mana, you use both colors, and you can take a creature from the battlefield and pretty much put it into the graveyard. And then, of course, if Lazav is out, Lazav can become that creature.
Exactly.
Murderous Cut for 5 mana, destroy target creature, just like Murder, very nice, but this one has Delve.
Yeah, well, it's 5 mana, of course, but if you delve cards from your graveyard, which means you exile up to 4 cards from your graveyard, it costs 1 colorless mana less for each card removed this way.
Yeah, exactly. So potentially for 1 black mana, which is pretty realistic because we have a lot of mill and we mill ourselves a lot in this deck as well. Then we go to Aether Gale for 5 mana, return 6 target non-land permanents back to their owner's hands.
Yeah, which could be very relevant,
Huge.
especially against indestructible creatures and stuff, which you could counter later on. Then we also have Hex, it's for 6 mana, it's destroy 6 target creatures. Well, important to know about this card is that you have to have 6 targets on the battlefield. You can't destroy 5, you have to target 6 creatures.
Yeah.
So, one-on-one this is, well, less interesting, because maybe the opponent won't have 6 creatures. But in multiplayer you always have 6 targets, which is also a little bit the same with Aether Gale. You also need 5 targets, or 6 targets to return to your owner's hand.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the easiest ways for Lazav to become a really big fat creature of your opponents, is to counter these creatures and to destroy them while they're on the battlefield. However, another way is, of course, just to mill our opponents and hope that they mill something fat into their graveyard, and then Lazav can become that creature. So let's have a look at the mill cards. The first milling card is Codex Shredder. For a colorless mana, we get an artifact that taps. The target player has to put the top card of their library into their graveyard. What makes Codex Shredder pretty good is that you can pay 5 colorless mana, tap it, sacrifice Codex Shredder, and then return any card from your graveyard back to your hand. Nice to get a very useful card back from your graveyard. Yeah. Then we go to Ghoulcaller's Bell, also for a colorless mana. You can tap it. In this case, everybody has to put the top card of their library into their graveyard, including yourself, so that's a little bit nicer.
Yeah. Then we have Altar of the Brood. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent, so not you, only opponents, puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So this is, well, potentially more cards, more milling than Ghoulcaller's Bell, because whenever you put a land onto the battlefield, each opponent puts the top card of his library into the graveyard, but also when you put down a creature, another artifact, something else. So you might want to play this before you play your land on a turn. Well, of course, turn 1 that's impossible, but if it's turn 2, you want to play this first and then the land.
Yeah, does great work, this card, over the course of the game. Grind Clock for 2 colorless, you can tap it and put a charge counter on it, and then every time you tap it, you can have target player put X cards from the top of their library into their graveyard, where X is the amount of charge counters on it. So the first couple of turns you're going to be tapping it and just putting on charge counters. Later on in the game, when Lazav is on the battlefield, you're going to tap him to start milling.
Yeah, well, this is of course a little more difficult to use, well, because you have to choose when you put a charge counter on it, or when you put creature or cards from the top of a library into a graveyard, and you can only choose one opponent, so you choose the opponent with the biggest fatties in his library, of course. And what could be useful is just when there is enough in the graveyard for you to use, you can make this bigger, and then when Lazav comes onto the table, you put as many cards into the graveyard as possible to make sure there's a big creature card.
Yeah. Jace's Archivist for 3 mana is a 2/2 creature with pay a blue mana, tap it. Each player discards his or her hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards discarded by all players.
Yeah, so this is could be very nice, especially if you don't have the most cards in your hand, of course, and it puts down a lot of cards into graveyards.
Yeah, so if everybody's out of cards and one person still has 7 cards in their hand, then you do this, and then everybody discards their cards and everybody draws 7 cards. people will be happy about that, so they will probably leave Jace's Archivist alive for you because they'd be like, oh, wow, I get to draw more cards. But sneakily, of course, you're happy that cards are going into the graveyard because there might be a really nice fatty in there that Lazav can become.
It works better for you than for other players.
Exactly. Grinning Totem is a very interesting card for 4 colorless mana. It's an artifact where you can pay 2 colorless and tap it. Search your target opponent's library for a card. Exile that card, and then you may cast that card up until the beginning of your next upkeep phase. If you don't, then the card goes into the graveyard. So it's important to know that you can only really cast this card at the end of the last player's turn before your turn. Is that clear?
That is pretty clear. We put this under the milling cards. It's not exactly milling, but we treat it a little bit like it because you are gonna mill the best fatty in the whole game in a library. So that's what it does, and then Lazav can become it, or you can cast it.
Yeah. We go to Dreamborn Muse for 4 mana. We get a 2/2, and this card mills a lot because at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, or X is the amount of cards in their hand.
Yeah, this might be my favorite milling card in this deck. Well, it's gonna do a lot of milling, like we said before. A little bit like the Jace's Archivist, but now you don't draw cards. Well, nobody draws cards.
Yeah. A Mirko Vosk Mind Drinker for 5 mana. We get a 2/4 flyer, which is pretty good for 5 mana. And when Mirko Vosk Mind Drinker deals combat damage to a player, target player, so the player whose damage you dealt, has to reveal the cards from the top of his or her library and put them into the graveyard up until that person has revealed 4 lands.
So usually this is going to be somewhere like 10 cards, which is of course a lot, but it needs to get through, and you can only choose 1 player which doesn't have a flyer to block it. Well, still very big card.
Exactly. Stitcher Giraffe for 5 mana. We get a 3/4 with the ability to pay 3 mana, tap it. Each player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into their graveyard, then exile 2 cards, any 2 creature cards from the graveyard, and you get to put down a XX blue zombie creature token, where X is the total power of both cards exiled this way.
Of course, it is important to know that it can only be 2 cards you exile that have been put into the graveyard this way, so with this ability. What is also important to know that Lazav can still become a creature put into a graveyard, then exiled during the ability. Doesn't matter, it still went into the graveyard, so Lazav still triggers, and it still can become the creature. But what is also important that you can't instant speed a creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control during this ability when you want to exile it. You can do that.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that everybody has to put the top cards, so it's kind of nice. You get to get a good pick when you're playing multiplayer.
3 cards.
Yeah, the top 3 cards, yeah. Alright, well, those are the milling cards. As we said, there weren't that many, but together with the control spells and the milling spells, we're going to be able to get a lot of creatures into our opponent's graveyards, which is what Lazav, of course, wants. Then, once things are in the graveyard, then we're going to want to cast spells so that we can pull stuff back out of our opponent's graveyards. So let's have a look at the graveyard spells. We divide the graveyard spells into reanimation spells and copy spells. I'll start with the reanimation spells. We've got Phyrexian Reclamation for 1 black mana. Awesome enchantment, allows you to pay 2 mana, pay 2 life, and then you can return target creature card from your graveyard back to your hand. You can do this as many times as you've got mana and life to spare.
Yeah. When you have a graveyard deck, you really need this card. Which is important to know is that you can only return a card from your graveyard, of course, and we don't have a lot of creatures, but still this is going to be nice.
Yeah, unlike Animate Dead for 2 mana, which is an aura, also an enchantment, is able to enchant any creature from any graveyard, puts it back onto the battlefield under your control. It does get -1/-0 though.
But still, it's going to be a big fatty, of course. What is also important to know is that if Animate Dead gets destroyed in any way, the creature also gets destroyed, which is enchanted.
Yeah. Grim Return for 3 mana is an instant speed spell, and it allows us to put a creature from a graveyard back onto the battlefield, but only if it went into the graveyard this turn.
Yeah, so you might want to make sure you put a lot of creatures into graveyards. And of course, well, it is instant speed, so you can do it in an opponent's turn too.
Yeah. Then we get Ashen Powder, gives us a little bit more flexibility. For 4 mana, we can just put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control.
Yeah. Then we have Extract from Darkness for 5 mana. This is a very nice one, I think. You put 2 cards from each player's library into the graveyard, then put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So you can choose any creature in any graveyard. Oh, of course, some additional milling, so this is very big for this deck.
Yeah. With Rise from the Grave is also 5 mana, but in this case we get to put down a target creature card from any graveyard back onto our control, onto the battlefield. And it's also a black zombie in addition to its other colors. Yeah, that doesn't really matter that much.
No. Then we have Chainer, Dementia Master. It's for 5 mana. Well, it's a 3/3 and all nightmares get +1/+1. And what is cool about this card, of course, for 3 black mana and pay 3 life, put target creature card from a graveyard, so it can be any graveyard, into play under your control. That creature is a nightmare in addition to its other types, so it gets the +1/+1 from Dementia Master. And well, what is important to know, when Chainer Dementia Master leaves play, remove all nightmares from the game. So anything you put onto the battlefield with this card is gonna get removed, which is nasty, but they have to remove this card because it's gonna be too strong for you.
That's a great card,
yeah.
Especially because you can do it as many times as you want. It's kind of like a pumped up Phyrexian Reclamation.
Something like it, yeah.
Yeah. Sepulchral Primordial is next for 5 colorless and 2 black. So for 7 mana we get a 5/4 with Intimidate, which is nice for dealing damage to our opponents. On top of that, when Sepulchral Primordial enters the battlefield, you get to go to everybody's graveyard except for your own, so all opponents' graveyard, and put the best creature that they have back onto the battlefield under your control. This card is crazy.
Yeah, well, it's a 4-player game, of course. You get Sepulchral Primordial and the 3 biggest cards from the opponent's graveyards. So you have 4 cards, 4 creatures for 7 mana, and it's gonna be the best creatures out there.
Yeah, it does have to be 1 for each opponent, so you can't grab 3 from one opponent, but still, it's pretty sweet. Necromantic Selection for 7 mana as a sorcery that destroys all creatures. Then you get to return a creature card back onto the battlefield under your control, which died this way.
Yeah, so you choose the biggest creature that dies from Necromantic Selection. Of course, also your own creatures die, so Lazav dies too. Well, of course, well, whatever. Still, you're gonna be the only one with a very big creature on the battlefield.
Exactly, yeah. It's also gonna be a black zombie in addition to other types, and on top of that, you have to exile this card when you cast it.
Yeah, true.
Pretty good. Then we get Limdul the Necromancer for 7 mana. It's a 4/4 guy, and whenever a creature an opponent controls gets put into their graveyard, you get to pay 2 mana, 1 colorless and 1 black, and then you get to put it onto the battlefield under your control. And it's also going to be a zombie, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
And you can regenerate zombies for 2 mana. So not this creature itself, not Limdul the Necromancer, but all the creatures you got from graveyards onto the battlefield.
Yeah, and the beauty of it is, of course, we already have a couple of cards that return cards back from the graveyard to the battlefield and turn them into zombies.
Exactly.
So now we get to regenerate them.
True.
Pretty sweet. Grave Betrayal is the last one of the reanimation spells. It's for 7 mana. We get an enchantment that states, whenever a creature you don't control dies, you get to put it back onto the battlefield under your control, and it gets a +1/+1 counter. And it's also a zombie on top of that.
Yeah, also a zombie, so works very good with Limdul the Necromancer.
Yeah, pretty sweet. Sweet card. Then we're going to move on to the spells that copy things in our graveyard or in other people's graveyard. First we have Dimir Doppelganger for 3 mana. We get a 0/2. For 3 mana, we get to exile target creature card from a graveyard, and then Dimir Doppelganger becomes a copy of that card and gains this ability.
Yeah, of course, we do have to exile the creature, so that could be annoying. We can't put it onto the battlefield under our control again, but maybe there are some players with also a lot of cards that put down cards from their graveyard, so we can choose those opponents and make them lose those creatures from the graveyard.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't want to do that, you can use Body Double for 5 mana, and then Body Double comes in, he's a shapeshifter, and he becomes a copy of any creature in the graveyard.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah. Chancellor of the Spires for 7 mana. It's pretty expensive. You get a 5/7 with flying, so that's pretty nice. And when Chancellor of the Spires enters the battlefield, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from an opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost.
Yeah, so you can just choose the biggest instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard and cast it. On top of that, when you have this in your opening hand, it's a Chancellor, Chancellors do that, you can reveal it at the beginning of the game, so before the whole game starts, just when you draw your hand, of course. And then each opponent puts the top 7 cards from their library into their graveyard, which is of course huge for you. Well, you're gonna have a big advantage right from the bat.
Exactly, that's pretty sweet. You want this card at the beginning.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the last one, we get a Diluvian Primordial, also for 7 mana. We get a 5/5 flyer, and when he enters the battlefield, this time for each opponent you have, you get to cast an instant or sorcery spell from their graveyard without paying its mana cost.
Yeah, a little bit like the Sepulchral Primordial, also a Primordial, but this time of course you cast instants and sorceries from your opponent's graveyard.
Yeah, you do have to exile the cards after you've cast them, but you've pretty much already done a lot of damage, you know,
exactly.
by then. Alright, well those were the graveyard cards. Now we can have a look at additional utility cards which are going to help us out with our strategy. We've divided the utility cards into discard cards, graveyard synergy cards, and draw cards. The first one of our discard cards is Hypnotic Spectre. For 3 mana we get a 2/2 flyer, and when Hypnotic Spectre deals combat damage to an opponent, that opponent has to discard a card at random.
Yeah, and of course the at random part is the biggest part about this card. Ideally you will be attacking turn 4 with Lazav on the table. The opponent has to discard a card at random. Luckily they will discard a big creature card, a big fatty, so Lazav will become a very big fatty with hexproof. Your opponents are in trouble.
That's right. Then we have Siren of the Silent Song. For 3 mana we get a 2/1 flyer with Inspired.
Inspired means when this card untaps, each opponent discards a card and each opponent puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So additional mill, that's 2 cards per opponent in the graveyard per turn. As early as turn 5 of course, when Siren of the Silent Song untaps from the last attack phase from turn 4.
Yeah, it's a lot of options for Lazav. Then we get Blizzard Spectre. For 4 mana we get a 2/3 flyer, and when Blizzard Spectre deals combat damage to an opponent, you get to choose either that opponent has to return a permanent back to their hand, or they have to discard a card.
Yeah, usually of course you will choose they have to discard a card, but it could be when they don't have a lot of permanents. Well, for example against Malek, you would like to make them put a permanent back into their hand to make sure they don't have lands in the game as long as possible.
Pretty sweet. Then we go to the Graveyard Synergy cards. We have a Weight of Precinct 6 for 2 mana. We get a 1/1, but Weight of Precinct 6 gets +1/+1 for each creature in your opponent's graveyards.
Yeah, not like the Night Howler. Well, this one gets +X/+X, where X is the number of creature cards in all graveyards. So this one includes your own graveyard. And it has Bestow, which means for 4 mana you can put this as an enchantment aura on a creature, so preferably Lazav when he's a big trample fatty with hexproof, and then that creature, so Lazav, gets +X/+X, and in addition to that, when the creature you enchanted this on dies, this card will stay on the table. So when Lazav dies, it's a little bit unlikely because he has a hexproof, but it could happen with especially board wipes, then this card just stays on the table, so you will still have a big fatty.
Absolutely. Not unlike a Bone Horde. For 4 mana we get a, well, it's a living weapon. It's an artifact that gives a creature that it's equipped on +X/+X, where X is the number of creature cards in all graveyards, but it also comes with its own little 0/0 black germ token, and it gets attached to it. So immediately right off the bat you get a fat creature, and for 2 mana you can over-equip it to another creature.
Exactly.
Not too bad. Then we move to the draw cards. We have Notion Thief. For 4 mana we get a 3/1 with Flash, and if an opponent would draw a card except for the first one of their turn, they don't, and instead you get to draw a card. Pretty big.
Yeah, which is of course important about this card is that it has Flash, so you can just keep it in your hand, and while your opponents might think you will have a counter spell or a destruction spell in your hand with instant speed, but then you have this one whenever they put down something that draws them a lot of cards, then you draw a lot of cards instead of them.
Yeah, that's really, really nice. Then we have River Kelpie, our last card. It's for 5 mana, we get a 3/3, and whenever River Kelpie or another permanent is put into play from a graveyard, you get to draw a card, so when you're reanimating your things. In addition to that, whenever you play a spell from a graveyard, you also get to draw a card. And River Kelpie has Persist.
Yes. Persist means whenever this creature dies, it gets put back onto the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter, so it becomes 2/2. But it brings itself back from a graveyard, so this means you draw a card when this happens. And of course, what is important to know is that it is whenever another permanent is put into play from a graveyard, from anywhere, under any player's control. So it doesn't matter if it enters under your control, which is the same as a spell, so a sorcery or an instant played from a graveyard, you draw cards. So this deck does that a lot, so you will draw cards in and out of itself, the deck itself, but it could also mean your opponent's deck makes you draw cards.
Pretty sweet. Very solid guy for 5 mana. But naturally, as usual, we cannot cast any of these spells unless we have the proper land distribution, so let's have a look at the lands. We've divided the lands into 14 islands, 15 swamps, and 11 non-basic lands. First we have Dimir Guildgate, Frost Marsh, and Salt Marsh. They all come in tapped and can either give us a blue or a black mana respectively. Then we have Dismal Backwater and Jawar Isle Refuge, which are the same, except they also give us a life when they enter the battlefield.
Then we have Bojuka Bog. When it enters the battlefield, taps. And when it enters, you have to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Well, you have to do this, so this may seem a little bit like counter synergy. But in some cases, there is a deck that plays its own graveyard a lot, and you are gonna mill that person, and you don't want to do that. Then you can use this card to exile that player's graveyard. And of course, if anything, you can exile a graveyard that is least useful to you. And after that, of course, it counts like a swamp. It gives you black mana. Then we have Crypt of Agadim. Also enters the battlefield tapped. Gives you black mana, a little bit like swamp. But it has an additional option. You can pay 2 mana and tap it. Then you get black mana into your mana pool for each black creature card in your graveyard. This may not happen that easily, because you don't have a lot of black creatures in the deck. But if it does happen that you have 4 or more creatures in your graveyard, it can be very useful to use this ability.
Yeah. Then we have Vivid Creek and Vivid Marsh. They come in tapped, and the Vivid Creek can give us either a blue mana, and the Vivid Marsh can give us a black mana. However, when they come in, they also come in with 2 charge counters, and we can tap them and remove a charge counter to give us mana of any color. So Vivid Creek normally gives us a blue mana, but can be used twice to give us a black mana, and the Vivid Marsh can give us black mana, but can be used twice to give us blue mana.
Then we have Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds. These are cards that you can sacrifice, and then you can search your library for a basic land card, put it into the battlefield tapped. So you either search for an island or a swamp. Very nice. Yeah,
pretty sweet. I guess now it's time we have a look at the conclusion. In conclusion, this deck is a lot of fun to play. Lazav is an evil mastermind, because while you're waiting for your opponent to be casting their commanders, you've got counter spells in your hand waiting, baiting them. They know this, they can see the evil glint in your eye, and it just feels great. On top of that, when stuff does hit the table, this deck has so much removal that you can just remove whatever you want. And on the plus side, Lazav is waiting there to become that massive creature. So it's win-win, but pretty much both wins are for you.
Yeah, of course, the counterspells are the cards everybody loves to hate, because they just don't know what's gonna happen. And that is what I do like about this deck most, is that every time you play this deck, it's gonna be a very different game for you and your opponents, because the decks your opponents have are going to determine what you are able to do, because you're going to cast spells from their decks, and that's what I really like about this deck.
Yeah, you should have a look at the deck list, which we've put below for all the cards individually, and on top of that, this deck is pretty affordable.
Yeah, it's just below $31, and we did this calculation on magiccards.info. This is a site that compares a lot of shops that sell cards, a lot of prices. We chose the median prices of all these shops, and then we came to this price, and that is including the commander and including all the basic land cards. So everybody can really buy this deck pretty easily.
Yeah, and Lazav right now with his mastermind is compelling you to press on the subscribe button, because it allows us to make more videos, and it also lets us know that we're doing a good job, which makes us feel good and happy. And on top of that, It also gives us a chance for you to put down more comments, and we can make more videos, not only Commander deck tech videos, but all kinds of Magic related videos. So please hit that subscribe button so we can get on and start making all the variety of videos on top of that. Ruud, we have a question of the day.
Yeah, today we try to make this episode a little shorter without being less clear. We would really like to hear from you what you thought about that. You can leave your comments below this video. So that's it.
That's it. Well, I'm David.
And I'm Ruud.
And this was Budget MTG Decks.